The Apollo 11 mission is etched into history as humanity's triumphant first step beyond Earth, a feat of ambition, courage, and engineering celebrated across generations. Neil Armstrong took that immortal step, Buzz Aldrin followed, but while the world was captivated by two footprints in the lunar dust, a third astronaut was drifting silently in the void, watching from above, Michael Collins. The forgotten name, his role, crucial, his mission. Overshadowed, but now, in a shocking revelation decades later, he speaks, and what he's revealed has stunned the scientific world. Whispers of a secret mission, a solitary orbit, moments unaccounted for, and a haunting question: what really happened during those 48 minutes of complete radio silence on the far side of the moon? This isn't the story you've heard in classrooms or read in textbooks. This is the untold story of the Apollo 11 mission from the man who didn't walk on the moon, but may have discovered something even stranger. While circling it alone, long before rockets lit up the sky, humanity gazed at the moon with wonder, myth, and superstition. Ancient cultures tracked its phases, tied it to tides, to madness, to gods. It was a silver mirror in the night, distant and unknowable. But everything changed with the space race, with the Cold War breathing down the necks of superpowers. The moon became more than a dream. It became a target. A strategic milestone in a global game of one-upmanship between the United States and the Soviet Union. The U.S. launched the Apollo program in 1961 with a simple yet terrifyingly bold mission: send a man to the moon, return him safely, beat the Russians, and do it all before the decade ended. It was a race not just for glory but for survival. What followed was one of the most intense scientific mobilizations in history. Billions of dollars, thousands of engineers, countless lives dedicated to a single goal: tests, failures, explosions, sacrifice. But in the end, it all came down to three men, destined for history. One destined for solitude. Born on Halloween in 1930 in the shadowy corridors of Rome, Michael Collins entered the world not as a man destined for fame, but as a silent force orbiting greatness. His father, a decorated U.S. Army Major General, ensured that Collins' early life was anything but stationary. From Puerto Rico to Texas, from New York to Virginia, his childhood was a whirlwind of movement. Truthful, observant, and disciplined. It was in Puerto Rico during a routine plane ride that something awakened in young Michael, a gravitational pull, not to Earth, but away from it. Aviation called to him, not as a profession, but as a compulsion. And when the world descended into war and the Collins family moved to Washington, D.C., that obsession only intensified. While others saw aircraft as weapons, he saw them as vehicles to something higher. By 1948, Collins had graduated from the elite St. Albans School. Instead of embracing his father's Army legacy, he made a quiet but pointed decision: he would join the Air Force, not out of rebellion, but to avoid accusations of nepotism and to chart his own skybound course. West Point came next. In 1952, he earned his Bachelor of Science degree and immediately entered flight training. His path was swift, merciless, and filled with close calls. At Columbus Air Force Base, he trained relentlessly, eventually earning his wings and progressing to advanced training. Nellis Air Force Base followed, where Collins flew F-86 Sabres, metal beasts designed for nuclear delivery. Here, the stakes rose and the risks became personal. By 1956, he had already cheated death. During a NATO exercise, Collins was forced to eject from a malfunctioning aircraft in France. He survived narrowly, but something in him had changed. He was no longer just training to fly. He was now training to endure. In France, he met Patricia Mary Finnegan, a strong-willed woman of different faith and background. Against all odds and despite familial pressure, they married in 1957. Together, they had 3 children, and while love grounded him, the sky still called. From 1959 to 1963, Collins transformed from a skilled pilot into something far more rare, a tactician of the air. He traveled the globe training other pilots and mechanics, amassing over 1,500 flight hours in the process. It wasn't just experience, it was preparation. And he knew it. His admission to the USAF Experimental Flight Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base marked a turning point. Among his classmates were names that would become icons: Frank Borman, Jim Irwin, Tom Stafford, but Collins was different. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing the frontier beyond it. It was John Glenn's historic Mercury Atlas 6 flight in 1962 that finally tipped the scales. Collins watched, transfixed, as Glenn orbited the Earth, a solitary figure wrapped in fire and silence. That was the moment. Collins knew he had to go further beyond the Earth's pull, beyond applause. He applied for NASA's second group of astronauts, but was quietly rejected. Most would have walked away. He walked deeper into the fire. He enrolled in the Aerospace Research Pilot School, flew F-10 for starfighters, and tasted weightlessness. He studied orbital mechanics like a monk studies scripture. When NASA called again in 1963, he was ready. This time, Deke Slayton, the gatekeeper of the astronaut corps, offered him a spot personally. Collins had logged over 3,000 flight hours, most in jets, but this wasn't just about numbers. He had become a man engineered for the void. Collins entered NASA's orbit as the Gemini and Apollo programs surged forward. During Gemini 10, he became the first person to perform two spacewalks on a single mission. It was a test not just of machinery, but of the human psyche. Out there, tethered to nothing, floating in silence, he discovered something he wouldn't admit for years. Solitude didn't terrify him. It comforted him. He was slated for Apollo 8, but fate intervened. A spinal issue, a slipped cervical disc, forced him into surgery and off the mission. While others saw a setback, Collins saw an omen. He was being positioned for something bigger. And that something was Apollo 11. By 1969, the crew had been selected: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. 3 men trained to deliver on a promise made by John F. Kennedy to put a man on the moon before the decade closed. Behind the scenes, Collins wasn't just preparing physically. He was architecting the mission's backbone. He trained exhaustively in docking simulations, wrote a 117-page document mapping out 18 different rendezvous scenarios, and designed the Apollo 11 patch himself, an eagle clutching an olive branch descending onto the lunar surface. Every symbol was intentional, every maneuver premeditated. Even the spacecraft names were laced with mythology and subtle rebellion. Armstrong chose Eagle for the lunar module. Julian Scheer, NASA's PR genius, floated the name Columbia. For Collins, command module, an allusion to exploration, conquest, and the spirit of the unknown. But while Armstrong and Aldrin trained for glory, Collins prepared for the unthinkable: abandonment. If something went wrong on the moon's surface, if Eagle couldn't take off, he would be forced to return alone, a man forever tethered to a failed dream. NASA prepared a speech for President Nixon titled, "In Event of Moon Disaster." It was never delivered, but it lingered like a ghost in Collins' mind. And then came July 16, 1969. 1 million people gathered at Kennedy Space Center, necks craned, breaths held. Across 33 countries, millions tuned in. At 9:30 a.m. EDT, the Saturn V rocket ignited the sky. The journey had begun. Collins performed the crucial maneuver of docking Columbia with Eagle, then watched as his two crewmates climbed into the lander. As they descended toward the lunar surface, he was left behind 100 kilometers above, orbiting the moon. Utterly alone, for the next 21 hours, Michael Collins would become the most isolated human being in recorded history, and for 48-minute intervals each orbit as Columbia passed behind the moon, all communication was severed. No radio, no telemetry, nothing, just him, The stars and the secrets of space. What happened during those silences? He never said, not fully. Not until now. As Collins slipped behind the moon, Earth disappeared. Radio signals vanished. The silence was not figurative, it was total. Not a whisper from Houston, not a pulse from Armstrong or Aldrin. Just the cold hum of machinery and the infinite dark pressing against the windows, and yet he didn't panic. He drifted in that lonely black sea with an eerie calm. The solitude wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary. Alone with his thoughts, Collins was now farther from another human than anyone had ever been. Behind a celestial body that blocked all communication, he wasn't just isolated, he was effectively erased. He peered out into the lunar abyss below him. The far side of the moon stretched endlessly, a jagged wasteland of craters untouched by sunlight or history. It was a world hidden from Earth since time began. No eyes had ever seen it, no telescope had ever mapped it. This was pure unknown. And Collins was the first. There was something unsettling about that, something sacred. He later described it not as loneliness but as a moment of perfect stillness. Yet in that stillness, questions whispered. Questions he never voiced publicly until much later in life. He hinted at anomalies. Shapes on the lunar surface that didn't align with geologic logic, glints of movement, signals that briefly blinked on, then vanished, phenomena that telemetry could not explain. The kind of unexplained that doesn't get written into mission reports. He never used the word alien, but he didn't have to. In one of his final interviews, Collins alluded to that time behind the moon as not silent but silenced. The way he said it, the pause after, it lingered. It wasn't just what he saw, it was what he felt. An overwhelming sense that something was watching. Something ancient, something that had waited a long time to be seen. He never broke protocol, never made public claims, but when asked if he believed we were alone in the universe, his response was telling: I saw Earth from out there. A tiny marble, the only color in an ocean of black. It was beautiful, but it felt observed. On the far side of the moon, there is no interference. No signals from Earth, no satellite noise, just pure silence. Astronomers have long dreamed of setting up observatories there where nothing from Earth can cloud the signals from deep space. It's the perfect place to listen, and Collins. He had 48 minutes per orbit to hear what the rest of us never will. Years later, China's change for mission would land in the moon's far side, the first of its kind. The goal, low-frequency radio astronomy. Searching for faint signals, echoes. That kind of science, back in 1969, was in its infancy. But NASA knew. They knew the potential of the moon's far side. They knew its silence was not emptiness, it was a blank page. A place where something might be written if one only knew how to read it. And Collins had been the first reader. Every orbit, he watched Earth rise, a fragile blue orb cresting the moon's jagged edge. He saw his home not as a nation or a continent but as a single, trembling presence in the void. That image would haunt him for the rest of his life. And then there were the contingency plans. The documents NASA never wanted to use. If Armstrong and Aldrin failed to launch from the moon, if the lunar module couldn't return, Collins was to return alone. A solitary survivor carrying the weight of two ghosts. He would become the man who left his brothers behind, the pilot who came home with empty seats. He later confessed that he'd rehearsed that scenario in his mind again and again. What would he say? What would the world see when the hatch opened and only one man emerged? There was even a pre-written speech buried in the National Archives for decades, written for President Nixon, a eulogy for Armstrong and Aldrin. A nation in mourning, but Collins not even mentioned. As if he were already a ghost, and maybe. For a while he was. He orbited in silence, counting down the moments. Each time Eagle's return was scheduled, he waited with a mix of hope and dread. Would he see the blinking lights of the ascent stage? Would the radio crackle back to life? And Then, finally, it did, a burst of static. A voice. They were alive. Eagle had lifted off from the moon. The rendezvous was clean. Collins performed the docking maneuvers with mechanical precision, but his hands trembled slightly, something he later admitted only once. The trio was reunited. History had been made, but the ghosts he met behind the moon, those remained with him. When they returned to Earth on July 24, 1969, they were heroes. Splashed down in the Pacific. Pulled into a waiting Navy vessel, paraded through streets. Showered with medals and dinners and flags, but in the quiet moments when the cameras left, Collins drifted. They called him the loneliest man in history. He hated the title, not because it was untrue, but because it misunderstood everything. He wasn't lonely. He was haunted. Haunted by the beauty of Earth seen from afar. Haunted by what he may have glimpsed in the shadows of the far side. Haunted by how close they came to catastrophe. And haunted by what NASA didn't tell the public. After returning home, Collins expected to be welcomed, celebrated, and then forgotten, but what he didn't expect was the title the press stamped onto him like a scar, the loneliest man in history. It made headlines. It sounded poetic, but to Collins it was absurd. During the debriefings, journalists circled him, hungry for the emotional cracks. "Did you feel isolated, afraid, broken?" He chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because it missed the point. He wasn't lonely. He was focused, intent, almost exalted. The truth was, while Armstrong and Aldrin made history with their boots in lunar dust, Collins had orbited a more psychological terrain. One where time dilated, silence grew thick, and your place in the universe shrank to something almost imperceptible. He later described feeling not fear, but clarity, a sharp awareness that he was part of something far beyond his comprehension. But his clarity would soon be shadowed by the revelations that followed. Upon their return, the Apollo 11 crew was immediately shuttled into isolation. Not because of publicity, but because of something darker: quarantine. NASA feared they might have brought back more than moon rocks, pathogens, microscopic stowaways from a foreign world, inside the metal shell of the lunar receiving laboratory. They were sealed off from the world for 21 days. Collins, Aldrin, and Armstrong smiled for the cameras behind glass, American heroes under microscopic suspicion, but what the public never knew was how flawed the system truly was. Years later, Collins admitted it openly. The Apollo quarantine protocol had multiple containment breaches. The astronauts' suits leaked lunar dust, ultrafine and clingy, impossible to remove. Sterilization equipment failed. Cracks in the lab's ceiling weren't fixed in time. And then there was the hatch itself. It had been opened in the Pacific Ocean, seawater, air, and potentially lunar material all exchanged freely. The entire process, Collins later admitted, was more symbolic than secure. A 2024 study from Georgetown University confirmed what Collins had hinted at all along. Had lunar microorganisms existed, Earth's biosphere would have been completely exposed. No backup plan, no second chance. Even President Nixon himself, who shook hands with the astronauts shortly after their return, had been put at risk. Goal for optics. For a moment of victory in a war of ideology, NASA's internal logic was brutally pragmatic. They acknowledged the risks, but the probability of harmful lunar life was considered low. So they focused on high-probability failures: rockets exploding, modules failing, astronauts dying, global extinction by moon germ unlikely. But not impossible. This logic sacrificed low-probability mass threats for high-probability local ones. Was the cold math of the space race, and it continues today. In nuclear risk policy, in AI development, in climate decisions, even now, with countries racing toward Mars, a world far more likely to harbor ancient life, this same gamble lingers. The unsettling truth is that humanity is willing to risk everything if the odds are low enough. Collins knew that. He lived it. But instead of despairing, he accepted it with a quiet stoicism. He wasn't a man of speculation, he was a man of function. Of duty, still, the question persisted, what if? What if the moon had given back something? Invisible? What if the silence on its far side wasn't just emptiness, but the echo of something watching? Something waiting, asterisk, he never said it aloud. Never accused, never theorized. But in his private writings, Collins returned to one image again and again: Earth, rising above the lunar horizon, alone and fragile, the only color in a field of black dot. To him, that image wasn't hopeful, it was haunting, a reminder that we are a singular species, huddled together on a trembling orb, suspended in the unknown. Asterisk, he once wrote, the Earth is the only thing in space that casts shadows that feel familiar. After Apollo, Collins didn't chase more missions, he retired from NASA in 1970, choosing instead to direct the National Air and Space Museum, and later to live a quieter life. He gave lectures, wrote memoirs, and then, slowly, faded from the spotlight. Asterisk, but even in retirement, he couldn't escape the solitude he'd become a symbol of. People remembered the moonwalkers, the footprints, the flag. Few remembered the silent sentinel who orbited in darkness, keeping watch, waiting to bring them home. Decades later, when asked how he wanted to be remembered, Collins didn't talk about glory or duty or sacrifice. He said simply, I was part of something that succeeded. But the silence behind the moon, the unseen side, the 48 minutes with no eyes, no ears, no oversight, that part of the story he took with him, and maybe that's the real mystery, not what he saw, but what he chose not to say. Michael Collins never asked to be remembered. He never craved the spotlight. But sometimes the quietest figures carry the loudest truths, and now, decades later, his silence speaks volumes. Was there more to the Apollo 11 mission than history admits? Did Collins witness something behind the moon that even now remains classified? Or is his legacy simply the embodiment of devotion, sacrifice, and the cost of exploration? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain: sometimes the greatest mysteries in space orbit just out of sight. What do you think Michael Collins truly experienced during those 48 minutes in complete isolation? Let us know in the comments below. And if this video made you question what's really out there, subscribe to Curiologics, hit that like button, share this story with someone who still thinks they know the whole Apollo 11 mission. Because sometimes the man who stayed in the shadows saw the most.